I'm Chris Avery, Director of Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I'm here today with Rebecca MacKinnon, a leading expert on global internet policy and human rights. Rebecca has just published this book, Consent of the Network, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. And Rebecca, let's start by looking back on when you were CNN bureau chief in Beijing in the late 1990s. At that point of time, what were you first expecting that the human rights impact of the internet would be in China, and what in fact transpired?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was in China working as a journalist when the internet first arrived there, and I think like most journalists in China at the time, and most diplomats, or any observers for that matter, assumed that the Chinese Communist Party could not survive the internet. I'm not sure if we were clear on what the human rights implications would be, but the political implications we assumed would be the disintegration of the one-party state. But what we've seen over the years has been that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, have adapted to the internet and evolved and figured out how to both manipulate and use the internet. Not so that they're controlling everybody all the time by any means, but they're controlling enough and they're manipulating enough that they prevent a direct challenge to their authority. They are able to prevent people from mounting a direct challenge to the Communist Party while enabling people to kind of expose smaller abuses so that people feel freer to speak, but their right to speak is no more guaranteed than it ever was. And if you try to stage a demonstration peacefully that criticizes the central leadership, you will go to jail as usual.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on with some other questions, let me give you a bit more background about Rebecca. Rebecca, as we mentioned, was headed the CNN bureau in Beijing in the 1990s and later in Tokyo. Then she left television to become a blogger and co-founder of an international bloggers network called Global Voices Online. She is on the board of directors of the Global Network Initiative and the Committee to Protect Journalists, and is currently with the New America Foundation as a Bernard L. Schwartz Fellow. Rebecca, I wanted to ask you at a very basic level what you see as the main human rights being infringed or threatened by the internet, and specifically what are the concerns?
Well, in today's modern society, the individual's life is increasingly dependent on network services, on internet platforms, on mobile technology. And these services and platforms are primarily owned and operated by the private sector. So the concerns relate to free expression, the extent to which speech is being censored or manipulated, and also the right to organize, and the right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, or shall we say surveillance, and the extent to which unreasonable sort of access to people's personal data results in human rights violations, or people being arrested for attempting to organize peacefully or for peaceful speech, or facing worse than arrest because their information has been shared or accessed by authorities and others in different ways. So it's privacy, it's freedom of expression, it's the right to organize.
Isn't it true, though, that some companies, such as Facebook, say, look, our policy is that everybody should be upfront and identify themselves when they're using our services? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, all of these services in various ways are creating platforms that enable activists to kind of empower themselves and speak truth to power and challenge authority. But I think what you're referring to is Facebook's requirement that everybody use Facebook with their real name. That's part of their terms and conditions. And they also tend to change their privacy policies quite a lot to make more of your information more open. And Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO, believes that people who are not open about who they are lack integrity, and he's sort of imposing his worldview on his users. It's also commercially a a useful way to go if you're selling advertising. But what this shows is a lack of respect for people who are vulnerable to discrimination, to persecution, to arrest, because they might be using Facebook to organize. They might be living in an authoritarian country, or they might just be a vulnerable or controversial minority in a democracy as well, who requires privacy. And so the lack of respect for these rights by companies like Facebook is very troubling.
Let's look at the Arab Spring for 1 minute. The internet, social media, it was all technology extremely useful to human rights advocates in the Middle East. But there were also problems on the other side in terms of government surveillance. How do you see the Arab Spring and the use of the internet and social media in terms of both the pros and the cons?
Mm-hmm. Well, social media was no doubt very helpful to activists in organizing protests. I don't think one can say that Facebook caused the Arab Spring, as some people seem to think. There was a lot of good old-fashioned on-the-street activism that was going on. There was a big impact of Al Jazeera. There was a big impact of sort of people who'd been building networks across the region for a good decade, long before social media really existed. So there were a lot of factors, but certainly the internet enabled people to communicate, to get the message out, to organize in ways that was very important. But at the same time, you've been seeing, for instance, in Egypt, activists a couple months after Mubarak stepped down got into the state security headquarters and were able to see their files, and it was just reams and reams of their email messages and their cell phone text messages and so on. And surveillance is quite pervasive in most of these countries. And there's a lot of stories of people in Syria, for instance, where the Arab Spring has not gone so well, of people getting arrested and killed because of things they posted online that were captured through various surveillance techniques. And so there are circumstances where using digital media in an environment where surveillance is heavy and rights are not respected may not always be the safest way to organize. Right. And so I think some people are revisiting their offline strategies for that reason.
You've been a key player in the Global Network Initiative, and you are now on its board of directors. Could you please describe the initiative and say a few words about what you see as the progress it's made, but also the challenges?
Well, the Global Network Initiative is a multi-stakeholder initiative modeled somewhat after other multi-stakeholder initiatives in other industries, be it the EITI with the extractive sector, or the FLA with Fair Labor Association, voluntary principles to some degree. They're just different types of initiatives where you, and with this one, it's for the internet and telecommunications sectors, and the idea is to get companies to sign on to core principles of free expression and privacy and human rights protections for the internet, and then agree to be held accountable to them. And the idea being that trust but verify is that they are making a commitment, but we need to be able to prove that they're actually doing this. So there's an assessment process that goes on.
And who are the members of the initiative?
So the members include both companies, human rights groups, and other civil society organizations. So like Human Rights Watch and so on, socially responsible investors and academics. And the companies so far are Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft, plus a web filtering company called WebSense and a small startup called Evoca. We're talking to other companies, but
why not more companies so far?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One is that despite the fact that the internet telecommunications companies are very cutting edge in many ways, they're kind of laggards when it comes to understanding that they have social responsibilities. That while the extractive sector, the oil and gas and mining companies, manufacturing sector, have long recognized that they have environmental responsibilities, they have labor responsibilities, they have human rights responsibilities in the physical world, and that this is kind of normal. and a social, a basic social expectation, an expectation of consumers, an expectation of investors, an expectation of government, and of kind of society at large. Somehow the technology sector has not gotten the message that they have social responsibilities, and in part it's because of their attitude that they are by definition empowering, so therefore, you know, just by existing, they've been socially responsible. So what more do you want? But the problem is that these companies are making decisions with their software programming decisions, with their engineering decisions that affect what you can and cannot do in your digital life. And these decisions, you know, how your privacy is manifested or not, how your identity is known or not. You know, how your information is manipulated, what you can see, what you can't, under what circumstances. That all has a impact on your political life and potentially on your ability to exercise your rights. And the companies, most companies are kind of failing to take human rights into account when they're thinking about these decisions, these programming decisions or design decisions or business decisions. And the point of this initiative is that they need to take these things into account. It's their responsibility to do so, just as other companies are taking environmental considerations into account when they're making decisions about how to organize their business. So we're hopeful that more companies are going to recognize that this is not only the right thing to do, but it's in their long-term self-interest, just as being environmentally responsible is in the long-term self-interest of companies. But it does take a while, and without pressure from consumers, without pressure from investors, without pressure from society as a whole, it will be hard to get these companies to recognize their responsibilities. I mean, you didn't get companies recognizing their environmental and labor responsibilities just because they woke up on the right side of the bed one day. You know, it's because of a long-sustained global movement. And so we need more pressure.
Well, the Global Network Initiative has the power to conduct an independent assessment of its corporate members' compliance with the core principles. When will this happen, and will that be made public?
Yeah, well, the first phase of assessments was just completed on the first 3 member companies. You know, what I can say now is that it was completed successfully. That the assessors found that the companies, you know, have put into place the kinds of mechanisms that they need to put in place to evaluate the human rights implications of their products and services and businesses, and that more details of this are going to be released in our annual report, which is coming out this spring. And the other stakeholders in the initiative found that, you know, not that there aren't problems and issues that need to be addressed, but that the companies are taking this seriously and are making real efforts. So the next round of assessments will look at actually how they're putting these things now into practice and what this means on the ground in terms of the effects.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a question about that. Yahoo is one of the members, as you said, of the initiative. And as a practical matter, because they're now a member of the initiative and because of the steps they've taken, does it make it much less likely that a case like Shi Tao would arise again? Shi Tao being the Chinese journalist who was imprisoned in 2005 after Yahoo China provided his personal details to the Chinese government.
Well, I think definitely, as far as Yahoo is concerned, you know, I can't speak for companies that are not members of the initiative that might have similar situations going on in other places or in China. But as far as Yahoo is concerned, I do feel they've put into place the kinds of checks that will prevent this type of thing from happening again. And in fact, when they rolled out a Vietnamese service a few years ago, they conducted a human rights assessment before they rolled it out. And because they wanted to avoid having this type of circumstance happening again, they based the Vietnamese service out of Singapore, so that you wouldn't have the same situation with the police showing up demanding information from local employees, and local employees being faced with the prospect of going to jail and becoming human rights victims themselves
Right.
if they do not comply.
Right.
So, it's about companies thinking through what they are doing, where, and why.
Okay.
And so Google and Microsoft, for instance, never put an email service in China because they wanted to avoid repeating the mistakes that Yahoo had made.
Right.
So I think not only has Yahoo learned from that mistake, but other companies have learned from it. And part of the point of the GNI really is to prevent Shurtao cases
Right.
from happening.
Right. Okay. Great. You and I have discussed briefly before the recent invitation by the Pakistan government, invitation for tech companies to bid for providing filtering software to the government of Pakistan. And some Pakistani human rights advocates then put together a petition calling on these companies to refuse to bid for the contract because of the fear that it would be used for censorship by the government. It's been very interesting over the recent week that our organization has gone to these named tech companies, asking them how they're going to respond to the petition. And we've received responses from 3 of them, WebSense, Verizon, and Sandvine, who have now made public statements saying they will not respond to the tender. Indeed, WebSense said it will not only will not submit a bid, but it called on other tech companies to refuse to bid for this contract. And we're still waiting to hear from other firms, but is this interesting to you, this development? Do you think it's promising for the future?
I mean, the fact that 3 companies have pledged not to sell.
Yeah, and the fact that civil society is putting companies on the spot to come out.
I think this is part of a development that, people are paying more attention to what companies are doing. I think up until just a couple of years ago, people were not paying much attention to what companies were doing in a lot of countries. And we're not paying attention to the role that technology companies play in people's human rights.
Yeah.
And now civil society is much more active,
Yeah.
and that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. Okay. Just to conclude, I just want to finish by asking you, why you wrote this book at this point in time, and if there's one message you give to people who might consider reading the book, what do you want people to get out of it?
Well, I think the main point of the book is that the internet is not a force of nature. What you can do with it today, what you can't do with it, what sort of freedoms you have on it, are not the product of some kind of natural development. They're the product of decisions being made by human beings over time, by engineers, by software developers with companies, by business managers, by lawyers, by regulators, by other people who are using the internet every day. So the future of the internet really depends on all of us and whether we seek to ensure that it develops in a manner that is compatible with democracy and compatible with human rights and compatible with the kind of society that we want to have. It's not inevitable that the internet is going to wind up being liberating or wind up being enslaving. It depends on us and what we do with it. And if civil society does not get involved with trying to make sure that the internet remains human rights compatible, then companies and governments will shape it to their liking, and that may or may not be in the direction that is going to be most human rights compatible.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Thank you.